We've never seen anything like this. It's the #1 killer in the US for those under 50. Many were minor children. More dead each year than 3 wars that spanned 5 decades. It's everywhere. Stopping the crisis will require unity and leadership.
My name is Paul Martin, and I'm the founder and chief executive of United Against Fentanyl. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that preserves and protects humanity with a focus on combating the fentanyl or the synthetic drug crisis. And it's a real true honor to have today with me Ray Donovan. Ray was the third highest ranking official in the Drug Enforcement Administration, and Ray retired in 2023 after 28 years, I believe it was, with the DEA. He served as chief of operations, overseeing all enforcement operations worldwide. Previously, he served as special agent in charge of the DEA's New York division, the central office for handling the highest level of issues pertaining to narcotics, money laundering, narco-terrorism, and other cases, and also special agent in charge of DEA's Special Ops Division, the central point of all counter narcotics operations government-wide. And so, Ray, it's a real honor to have you. And Ray also serves as part of the United Against Fentanyl's advisory board. So, Ray, welcome.
Paul, thank you. Happy to be here. Looking forward to this.
Ray, there's been quite a bit of action in the past week that you know quite a bit about, and I've seen you on television speaking about it. This particular podcast and video is going to center on the People's Republic of China and their role in the fentanyl crisis. But I do want to, perhaps before we go into that, ask you a few questions about the capture of El Mayo and Guzman Lopez and the significance of that. These, from what I understand, are significant arrests in the Mexico part, or the cartel part of this fentanyl crisis. Tell us a summary, Ray, of what that was about and the implications.
So the first thing I would say, Paul, is that the circumstances behind the arrest or capture are not really clear yet. Whether it was a self-surrender by Joaquin, whether it was a capture or surrender by Mayo Zambada. Needless to say, both are in the United States. The capture of Mayo Zambada is incredibly significant. And I'll tell you why. Mayo Zambada really, along with Chapo Guzman and Juan Esparragoza, really changed the Sinaloa cartel. They inherited the cartel back in the 80s when Rafael Caro Quintero was the leader of the cartel, along with Felix Gallardo and an individual by the name of Fonseca. From that was the first generation of the Pacific cartel. Back then, they were primarily engaged in marijuana trafficking and then eventually cocaine trafficking out of Colombia. That is late 80s going into the 90s when Chapo Guzman, Mayo Zambada really took the cartel, and El Azul, aka Juan Esparragoza, took the cartel to the next level. From that point into the 90s up until the present, the cartel grew substantially throughout the world, 47 different countries throughout the world, and became the #1 criminal enterprise, not only in the United States, but worldwide. In the United States, we saw drugs go from their primary distribution from marijuana and cocaine to meth, to heroin, and now fentanyl. And I think, the significance of what it means for us in capturing Mayo Zambada is a change. There's going to be a dramatic change in the Sinaloa cartel right now. A lot of violence, unrest, because that old statesman trafficker is gone, and who really kept the balance of power in the Sinaloa cartel pretty stable or somewhat stable. Now we expect there to be a lot more changes, a lot more violence, people vying for position and power.
And what, I hope these questions aren't too ignorant, but what did he do? This is, I've heard the term consigliere, that this was a man, a bit older in years and stature. What was his role? Certainly
So
wasn't operations, right?
no, well, yes, it was operations. It was everything from Mayo had the relationships throughout
Okay.
Mexico, throughout Colombia. He would also be the one to call if there were war between cartels to try to establish peace. So Mayo's role was that of the lead leader, right? Sort of the statesman for them. They called him El Señor, because they would go to him if there were any issues or problems. Make no mistakes about it, he was also very violent and caused tremendous harm. Going back in the early days, in the 90s, the wars between the Sinaloa cartel and the Felix brothers out of Tijuana, there were many people caught in between their rise of power in Mexico. But the introduction of fentanyl, I think, is what really put a tremendous spotlight on the Sinaloa cartel, and in particular, those two factions. Keep in mind that Joaquin Guzman, the son of Chapo Guzman, also played a role. Now, he didn't play as a significant role as, say, his brother Ovidio or Ivan or Jesus Alfredo, but he certainly played a role in the cartel, being that he is the son of Chapo Guzman. And the Chapitos were very much involved with the production, the manufacturing, and the smuggling of fentanyl into the United States and throughout the United States. Mayo as well.
How is the DEA now? Was this capture? And I know there's overlap with the various law enforcement agencies in the United States. Is this something that the Drug Enforcement Administration is part of, or is this more of a, I don't know, DOJ or some other entity, or are you guys working together?
So there are multiple indictments on Miles and Bada. So that's where DEA would come in on the indictments, the investigations, the intelligence, the sharing of intelligence amongst federal agencies. That's where, and there is collaboration, certainly at the Special Ops Division and at the higher level in the Department of Justice.
Gotcha. So on the issue of fentanyl, which I continue, I'm a newbie to this in many ways compared to people like yourself or other guests that we've had, but there's a radical shift in just the way that narcotics has been looked at globally because of this remarkable spike, not just in deaths, but the nature of this particular drug. And most people that pay any attention to this know that the People's Republic of China plays a role. We want this Thought Leader series not to be for just those experts, but we want to make sure that we're speaking to, I think, many people that actually need to know these issues to really get their head around this crisis and its implications. Ray, what role does, in a general sense, does China play in just the simple production? And I know you serve on some committees, working committees with the House of Representatives committee within the House of Representatives. Kind of a bird's eye view, what do the Chinese companies do to support this insane problem that we're having in the US?
So in regards to production, China controls about 97% of all production of precursor chemicals that are utilized to fully manufacture fentanyl. And so at that scale, we're looking at roughly 160,000 chemical companies throughout China. That
160,000.
That's correct.
Wow.
And that's a State Department number, right? So 160,000 chemical companies exporting chemicals throughout the Western Hemisphere, not only directed towards fentanyl, it's also directed toward methamphetamine production, cocaine production, heroin production. But clearly, the biggest money maker right now is fentanyl and methamphetamine throughout the United States. They control that. It's also one of the most unregulated industries in China is the chemical industry.
Okay, so you have these companies, they're out to make a living, have a business, etc. They sell these chemicals domestically, and also some of them at least export these chemicals. And what types of chemicals are needed for fentanyl? Are these sophisticated, complex chemicals? Are they basic?
Well, they're all synthetic, obviously. And so some are sophisticated, others are not. And the issue that we were facing when it first hit the United States is if you just change one chemical compound, it's still fentanyl, just another variant of fentanyl. And it would no longer be on a list of illegal substances. And so the Chinese chemical companies were constantly changing the compounds, and we were working from behind until in May 2019, the PRC did create a law stating that all variants of fentanyl were illegal. But that didn't stop the flow of chemicals coming into the United States and into Mexico.
And as I understand it, there is finished fentanyl coming, at least to some degree, through the de minimis loophole, which is something I think I hadn't thought about. But there's a very kind of gripping article in Reuters last week about a reporter that just decided to go online and order fentanyl, and for $3,600, the individual had enough to make millions of pills. So can you talk about, so we have chemicals that are sold to cartels in Mexico so that the cartels could make it. Then we have finished fentanyl. Is there anything you can say about that part, the finished fentanyl?
Yeah. So actual finished fentanyl is what early on in 2013, 2014, 2015, we started seeing just the precursor chemicals, in particular 4-MPP or NPP or BAC-MPP. Along where propionyl chloride becomes fentanyl once you put them together. We started seeing that coming into the United States, and the demand, and that was then turned into fentanyl and then added to heroin for the purpose of making heroin stronger. So we saw a shift around that same time frame where the demand for pure fentanyl started rising. No longer just the mixing it into heroin. No, now the demand for fentanyl kilos was rising throughout the United States. At the time, 1 kilo of fentanyl from China was $3,000, right? But that same kilo could be turned into 250, 300,000 pills, and one pill at the time was being sold for $30 a pill. So you're looking at a $9 million return from $3,000. So people may ask, well, what drove the market on that? Clearly, the money drove the market, right? So that's what really pushed the cartel to continue to do that. Even today, Paul, when you look at what one pill of fentanyl is sold for, $1.50 or $1, and if you're still making that fentanyl kilo or buying it for today, maybe $8,000 to $10,000, you're still making $450,000 off of that 1 kilo. So the model, the business model, is what's driving this, as well as the synthetics. The fact that there's no longer a need to grow poppy plants in the mountains of Sinaloa, or Durango, or Chihuahua. There's no longer a need because now there's a stronger opioid that has a limitless supply of chemicals And so the cartel has adapted towards that, right?
Mm.
And they already had the connections because of methamphetamine.
Interesting. One of our goals with this new entity is to, and I already said it once to a degree, but to really try to make this case in a palatable way, because millions of Americans have heard of fentanyl. Hundreds of thousands, well, I'm sure millions have grieved the loss, whether it was an aunt or an uncle, a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, all in. We're talking about millions of people who are grieving the loss of a loved one, with, tens of thousands of dying each year. But after that, it starts to get murky. People know it's dangerous. They've seen the effective DEA campaign, which I think that you were a part of, informing the public that one pill can kill.
Right.
But still, we feel that to the degree that the general population doesn't just understand that, but understands that when they go to the voting booth, for example, that there are other factors involved in this massive crisis. And some of them are geopolitical. They are foreign, having to do with foreign actors. And so on that note, Ray, so there are these companies in China. They're companies that want to make money. There's a demand, especially from Mexican cartels, to order this stuff. And the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China, if you will, has, in that type of government, the ability, the capacity, it's an authoritarian regime, to say to these companies, stop.
They do.
Don't do this anymore, or else. And in that ecosystem, people understand what's said. And it's a loaded question, but does Xi Jinping have the ability to, at worst, curb the export of these chemicals that are ultimately killing Americans, or stop it? Does he have that power?
Yes, he does, and they certainly could. We've seen it happen, Paul. So in 2020, in lockdown, the lockdown in Wuhan, we saw an immediate effect in Mexico with production of fentanyl. So the chemicals were not flowing into Mexico, and so the prices of fentanyl, really the prices of many drugs, skyrocketed in the United States. But we know that particular fentanyl went up tremendously. But here's the real issue behind what's going on in regards to PRC and the CCP. The issue is that they are incentivizing the exportation of these chemicals, as well as Scheduled I drugs, fentanyl as well. It is being incentivized, or they're given tax rebates, many of these chemical companies, to export the drugs into the United States and into Mexico. So if the People's Republic of China wanted to stop the stem of illicit chemicals, they absolutely can. I mean, if you wanted to log on to the internet in China, everyone has a national ID card. So everyone is tagged, everyone is tracked. So similarly, it's very easy for the Chinese government to track all exports because they know every single company. And in fact, they own some of the chemical companies. And in fact, some of these CCP members sit on the executive committees of these chemical companies. So there are direct connections between the government and the chemical industry in China. And so it could turn overnight if there was willingness from the PRC to stop the flow of illicit chemicals into this side of the world.
And then it begs the next question: why wouldn't they put the hammer down?
Well, it's several reasons, right? So for when I look at this, I mean, first I look at economics, the amount of money that they're making, being the world's leader in chemical production, not only United States and Europe and Africa, all over the world. You're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. That's first and foremost.
So chemicals for China's GDP is significant.
Yes. Yes, it absolutely is. It's worldwide. They are the dominant country in production of chemicals. India is second to them, but really China is the lead. And so that's the first issue for them is, well, we're making so much money, and they see the fentanyl problem as an American problem, not a Chinese problem, right? They don't see it as an issue in China. They see it as an issue for Americans, and they see it as purely a demand issue in America, right? So that's the first sort of position, is that. The second is, well, if that's an American problem, then America needs to solve their demand problem. So it pushes back on the American and our government to jump in. I do think that it's intentional, though, Paul. I do think that it also tears at our economy. I think it also tears at the social fabric of America. And I do think that there's a long game that the Chinese are playing in regards to that.
Well, I mean, just in a very basic sophomoric sense, if this drug isn't being made available to Chinese citizens, and if these chemicals aren't made available to the equivalent of Chinese cartels to make it, because the Chinese government is saying no, it seems a little
well,
like a contradiction to say that, it's just your demand problem.
Right. Well, let me preface that. There are 3 companies in China that have a license to produce fentanyl for for use throughout China, right? So that, let me just say that. But as far as illicit distribution, that doesn't happen. That's not happening with fentanyl throughout China.
So this gets to a topic that I'm finding so intriguing and interesting. And again, just to supplement some of what we're focused on as an organization, and we say on our website, 100% enforcement and 100% education, because we see sometimes organizations get in this, it's a supply problem. No, it's a demand problem. And of course it's both.
It's both.
But let's talk about this, Ray, because if it's merely a demand problem, the Chinese people, the 1 billion Chinese people, don't have access to illicit fentanyl. There is no demand. Some might argue because there is no supply.
Right.
Talk to me about this dualism. Nobody would disagree that in the U.S. there's a demand problem.
Mm-hmm.
But with what the DEA found last year, which is 76 million pills and 14,000 pounds, and that's just what they found.
Right.
Seems like there might be a supply issue too.
Oh, there is a supply issue. There's no question about it. I mean, it goes back to the fact of what we already know. Once we stem the flow of chemicals coming into Mexico, we saw an immediate impact. So supply, you can't attack this problem just from one side, Paul. And I've always said this. If you try to attack it from demand and education, prevention, and treatment, it's a constant uphill battle. If you try to attack it solely from supply, it's the same thing. It has to come in from both ends to really have long-term impact, in my opinion. But from a law enforcement perspective, I look at the supply side and say, okay, well, where are the nodes within the supply chain that if we impact them, we would really slow or stem the flow? And so easily the first is at production, right? If the Chinese said, okay, let's just cut this down or regulate. Listen, every single company that's exporting chemicals to Mexico, they're on a list in China. So the Chinese know it. Why? Because they're getting tax rebates. So they know who they're giving tax rebates. They know that it's the number one chemical that the highest tax rebate of 13% is fentanyl derivatives. That's their language. That's not ours. It's listed on their state administration, tax administration website, right? As the number one exportation and the highest rate. So they could immediately impact this problem at production, right? Then coming into the Western Hemisphere, the ports in Mexico. So the ports are wide open. So Mazatlan, Manzanillo, Veracruz, that's an area or choke point where we can impact chemicals coming in. After that, you go into the actual laboratories, the clandestine laboratories. there was a time in 2014, 15, 16 where we, federal law enforcement, working with Mexican partners, were taking down over 100 labs a year, clandestine labs. Not all of them were fentanyl labs. There were meth labs and heroin labs, but that's the sort of activity that was taking place. That trickled down to single digits under the current administration in Mexico. The next choke point is the border, and the final choke point is social media platforms. So I speak about social media platforms in Section 230 Communications Act, and why that's so important to take a hard look at it. It is social media platforms are the new vehicle for distribution. They are the new vehicle for distribution. They have access to everyone's homes. Many of our kids are on social media platforms, but guess what? So are criminal groups. And it's very easy to advertise and market drugs. And that, to me, is an area where we as U.S. government, and when you talk about the UAF, United Against Fentanyl, and our group, what can we do? We can push change there, because that's where you'd see an impact, right? That's where we need to go, because that's where the criminal groups are, and we need to keep our kids safe.
Yeah, I sometimes think of the, this is maybe cheesy sometimes because people want to, but in a war strategy, you don't simply just drop bombs. You cut off finances, you cut off ports, there are embargoes, there's propaganda informing the public. I mean, there's many theaters of operation, if you will. And but of course that work is more complex, because you're not just looking at, we're going to distribute Narcan, which is vital, as you know. But to really look at each of these is a daunting task. And that gets to something that you and I spoke about a few weeks ago. And that's the word corruption. I tend to think of drugs. This is a fentanyl problem. We have a fentanyl crisis. It's the Ann Milgram's thing about it's the most deadly crisis and the blah, blah, blah. But you brought up something that I still think about, Ray. You said corruption is really at the core, or you said something like that.
I did.
Can you talk? And I know you're doing things on, you have a Financial Times video that's had 1 million views that is just riveting, because it's really not so much about fentanyl, although fentanyl shows up. It's about something that seems more at the root, which is corruption. I know we only have about 45 minutes, but is there something you can say about that comment about corruption?
Sure. So most people are focused in, and rightfully so, on the damage that illicit narcotics does to neighborhoods and communities and cities and towns all across America. From a law enforcement perspective, when we look at, well, what are the real driving factors behind the drug trade? And how is it that these cartels are able to thrive for decades? And so when you look at the backbone of these cartels, what's propping them up? And you'll see corruption. And so we, as an agency, in particular, just speaking to DEA, because I know it so well, we've focused many of our efforts throughout, the years on going after the head of snake, going after Chapo, going after Mayo, going after Mencho, and really trying to bring them down and bring them to justice and hold them accountable. Well, the real issue in Mexico is corruption. It's the real issue that is at the local, the state, the national level. It's why the cartels continue to exist. It's why they continue to thrive. It's why they continue to access into America. But listen, the damage is not only in America. Obviously, we're focused in on America. The damage is in Mexico. And the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed between cartel violence as well. Corruption is at the core. Is how can we, as United States government, really go after that piece? We've seen it in other countries. DEA is one of the lead agencies in pursuing corrupt officials throughout the world. And why is that? Is because we often see them connected to illicit narcotics. Why? Because there's so much revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. that's generated, and it's fast and it moves fast and it's accessible. And so that's where we see there's an opportunity for us to focus our efforts in that space to try to break down not only the cartels, but those that support the cartels. And that there has to be a shift there from a law enforcement perspective, in my opinion.
Interesting. And yet we have, under Lopez Obrador, there was a shift in his thinking, or his approach, it seems. For a while, it seems like he was, to some degree, eager to participate, and that ended, right?
Yeah, it did. I mean, as soon as AMLO came into power, we saw an immediate change in our ability to collaborate and cooperate with counterparts that we had a long history of sharing information with. The current Mexican government created the national security law that prohibited or really slowed our ability to share intelligence with law enforcement counterparts. They brought in civilians into the equation, which became a problem because we're not going to share actionable intelligence with civilians that are not aware or willing to protect the information. It became a roadblock for us in the sense that we weren't receiving information as well. But we saw a change in the willingness to go after these bad actors, right? It became hugs, not bullets. Yeah. It became the philosophy. And so what does that allow for the cartel to do? Grow and expand in power, right? And control and money. And not only just in drug trafficking, but in other different crimes as well. Cartels are like any criminal enterprise. If they can make money on something as small as scams or taxing commerce or robbing oil refineries, they're going to do that just like any other criminal group. And so we've seen that as well take place. We've also seen the number of seizures drop significantly in Mexico. There was a time where in Mexico, prior to AMLO, where the Mexican authorities were seizing hundreds of thousands of pounds of methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, and that dropped immediately. And so that pullback has really impacted the United States, and it's impacted Mexico as well.
And so for our U.S. government, law enforcement, et cetera, it's on the foreign soil, China and Mexico. You call them choke points. We have work to do in two nations, diplomatic in both cases. It seems like in Mexico, probably. So the DEA, this is, again, ignorant. I don't have a background in the DEA, but what do they have on the ground in Mexico, or is that all contingent on the government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So DEA has 10 offices in Mexico. So they have a pretty solid footprint. They collaborate to the degree that they can to this day. They share information to the degree that they can to this day. Our agents there work extremely hard with, and there are partners down there that are really good partners. So I don't want to paint this picture where everyone is corrupt or everyone is bad. No, there are some really, look, I'll give an example. There's no way we as a nation collaborating with the Mexican government would have caught El Chapo or other high value targets if it wasn't for collaboration with those counterparts in Mexico, right? So there is room there to get on the same page. And I think we have to do that for both nations. But the DEA does have, they're in 69 countries, over 330 offices worldwide, 23 field divisions. But Mexico is one of our top priorities as far as the agency goes, along with Colombia.
Wow. Okay, we're going to switch gears a bit, and this one is a new reality for me in many ways. In 2002, the Russian government put down a hostage situation in a theater in Moscow. Chechnyan rebels had taken over this theater, as you know, with hundreds inside the theater. And eventually, two fentanyl analogs, and analogs just means versions, were aerosolized. They were put in the air and effectively used as a chemical weapon. So they didn't go in with AR rifles and fire people down. They put something in the air instead. So in that case, it's a weapon. And many died. There was an official number from the Russians of, I think, 140, but family members have said it's far, far greater than that. We have, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of fentanyl in the United States currently. We have bad actors, whether they be foreign terrorist groups or domestic terrorist groups or individuals. We just saw an assassination attempt on a former U.S. president. Could fentanyl be used as some type of chemical agent in the U.S.?
Well, I think, Paul, you've already answered the question with the fact that it's already been used in aerosol. So I remember that clearly. When fentanyl first hit the United States, let me give you a quick little breakdown of when fentanyl first hit. We first saw fentanyl around 91 to 93.
91.
Wow. Yeah, it was being mixed with heroin on the streets in New York. It was called Tango and Cash, right? That was a Ohio-based chemist that was doing that. We zeroed in on him, took down that lab, immediately impacted it, changed it. Then in 2006, we saw a cluster of overdose deaths in Chicago that were attributed to a lab in Toluca, Mexico, that Sinaloa cartel had. We found that lab, took that down. Then in 2013, 2014, we started seeing the precursor chemicals for fentanyl production come into the United States and then being smuggled south into Mexico. In February of 2015, the DEA put out its first national alert of fentanyl to all law enforcement partners throughout the
When was that again?
In 2015.
2015.
Early February of 2015. We put out a national alert saying that fentanyl is now an increasing market across the U.S., illicit market.
So to be clear, the DEA HQ sends a communique across the board to police, to state trooper, to the whole group, saying there's stuff called fentanyl.
Right.
Pay attention. This is a major issue or an emerging issue.
Right. So that the reason why I give you the timeline is so that you understand we were all already thinking how fentanyl could be utilized and can it be used as a WMD. And so we brought it to the attention of Homeland Security, TSA in particular, and passed the ball to them. They started building out all their protocols, doing everything they would do to try to keep people safe from this happening. Our concern was closed-in areas, right? Mass transportation, things of that nature as it relates to the fentanyl. And if it was sprayed in an aerosol, what the impact would be. And so that was handed off to them at that point in time. But it was a concern early on when we first started noticing the fentanyl market grow throughout the U.S.
Yes, that's most certainly something. And in terms of a weapon of mass destruction, there could be a distinction between chemical weapon versus WMD, which implies, you've brought this to my attention, terrorism. Currently, as things are, let's just back up again to China, the People's Republic of China, these companies. I don't get the impression that these are terrorist acts, or would they be categorized?
No, I think they're more acts of greed. It's just the amount of money that is being generated.
Yeah.
But suffice to say, it doesn't mean that a group would not take advantage of this, right? And try to utilize it. It is a concern.
This is another, thank you for pointing out that I asked you a loaded question that I answered before I even asked your opinion. But I often hear, I was just in Washington, D.C. for some kind of group rally, remarkable human beings. But sometimes I hear what I would call silver bullet solutions to this problem, the fentanyl crisis. Some of them are rather politically charged, I will say, or partisan on both sides.
Right.
Uh, some from the far left, some from the far right. There's not an easy solution to this issue.
No, not at all. And I don't think there is a silver bullet. And I don't think that law enforcement can do it alone. I certainly, one of the things that we did while I was in the DEA was to start to reach out to these families that have lost loved ones nationally. And the reason why, what was the real push for that? The push was that DEA recognized that we were limited on our ability to reach, to get the word out about the dangers of fentanyl. So we had to bring in these families and many, non-for-profits to try to just engage with them so that they can push out the message that fentanyl is here and that it's not going to go anywhere and that it's causing tremendous harm. It goes to the larger issue, Paul, is that, it can't solely be law enforcement and it can't just be demand reduction. It has to be a coordinated effort across many different areas. There is no silver bullet, right? Prevention and treatment is just one piece. I do remember vividly, and I speak about this from time to time, about when the crack epidemic hit New York City, and I was there, and I remember that we were fighting crack, and the laws got really, really stringent, made it, in my opinion now, one-sided. But when you look at the campaign to really go after these kids and make them aware of the dangers of crack, it was unprecedented. I don't see that happening the way I think it ought to happen in regards to fentanyl use across the United States. Yes, One Pill Can Kill is a campaign that many people have seen, but how many people still are out there unaware of the dangers of fentanyl? I'm still dying from poisonings today, thinking that they're purchasing something that is not fentanyl. In fact, they're getting fentanyl. So there's so much more that we have to do in the space. I do think that from a nonprofit perspective, focusing in on 230, Section 230 would be of tremendous value.
And repeat again, for those listening, what is Section 230?
So Section 230 Communication Act really gives social media platforms the ability to say, hey, it's not my problem. This is third-party content. I have no responsibility for what they say and engage in. So therefore, I'm not held accountable for any of this. And I think we have to take a hard look. And I'm just giving it to you in layman's terms. There's more technical terms behind it, but that's an area that needs to be looked at, because I think social media platforms, first of all, are not going away. They are the vehicle for distribution. And I think the sooner we engage and change that and impact that, you'll see a change in distribution, because that's the key area, right? Before that, it was the dark web, marketplaces, but now it's open. It's social media.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the hearing that you were part of, the China Select Committee in April, you said something, it jumped out at me, but to the effect, I think it was you, gone are the days of going and meeting your dealer in some dark alley. Yeah. Now you just pick this thing up, whether you're 40 years old or 14 years old, mm-hmm. and you're doing your drug deal right here from your bedroom.
Yeah. And that's the change, Paul. The poll is technology has really made it easier. The world is a lot smaller because of it. And the criminal groups have taken advantage of it, of technology.
Yeah. I know that Snapchat, particularly of the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 players, have had quite a bit of press given this lawsuit of 60 parents who, I know some of these parents, and it's the saddest thing you've ever heard, because the last thing these kids were drug dealers, mm-hmm. Drug users, or people struggling with substance use disorders. They were normal kids like right. you and I were, mm-hmm. experimenting like kids do, Actually, there's nothing really nefarious. It's called growing up and testing stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
But given the potency of this stuff, that was the end for them.
Right.
This is one of the things in my day in and day out, and you kind of alluded to it, Ray, is we all have to have reference points in life, or else we just can't be experts on everything. And so what I hear so often, I mean, I will hear this today.
Mm-hmm.
People say, "Oh yeah, drugs are really bad. I remember when I was in high school, I knew someone that used cocaine," and their referent is a substance that is not anything like
Right.
the fentanyl that we know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would take a lot of cocaine. I mean, you know more about this. I saw a photo of you, by the way, of some big bust back in your day with a bunch of bags behind you. You
Yeah.
look a little tiny bit younger, by the way. But there's still this, there's just still this ignorance about this stuff. Like, oh yeah, cocaine is bad and marijuana is really bad for you. And I'm
Right.
kind of like, guys, there's a lot of work to be done,
Yes.
despite the tremendous work that you and others did in the
Mm-hmm.
One Pill Can Kill campaign.
There's a lot more work that has to be done to save lives, and ultimately that's what unifies us all. So we want to save lives. We want to keep people away from the dangers of certainly some of these hardcore drugs. And keep in mind, Paul, it's not only fentanyl. There's many other opioids now coming to the market, the protonitazines, the nitazines, the xylazines, that are now on the streets across America as well, being mixed with fentanyl. So it makes it even harder, more potent than ever before.
Yeah, that's something too. I mean, I guess, I'm kind of describing the ignorance, and we're all ignorant, but this shift is happening so fast. I mean,
Mhm.
with some of my contacts, and I do some field work, if you will, in northern New Mexico, they're telling me that every drug that is on the street is not just cut with fentanyl anymore, but it could
Right,
be cut with, like exactly what you're describing. There's
right,
just no such thing really as a pure, I mean, maybe in rare cases, but these things are being cut into pretty much anything, and it's really scary. Ray, you touched on something that I've been thinking a lot about, and
Mhm.
as we are in our fourth month of launching this organization and having some remarkable men and women like yourself come along with us to coach us and guide us and provide expertise. You brought this up, or you alluded to it. When we think of social ills out there today,
Mhm.
things that politicians, presidential candidates are going to talk about. And we've heard them before. We've heard about homelessness. We've heard about climate. We've heard about abortion. So I'm talking about issues that are left or right. They are
Mhm.
not either. NRA, gun safety, LGBTQ rights. Back in the day, it was the dangers of smoking cigarettes, mothers against drunk driving, right? You have these social ills. And with each of those, and this is something as we plan out our year, and we're spending a lot of time, our next phase, each of these social ills had a social and even a political movement around it.
Right.
Every one of these
Mhm.
massively. And it seems like with this shift to synthetic drugs, we're in just the embryonic stage, because that movement, it almost can't exist because it's too new of a phenomenon. It,
Right, right. But I also think, Paul, that there is a change obviously going throughout the United States, even with the stigma that was once attached to drug use. Right? We're evolving, right? So there was a time where there was a shame, people were shamed because they used drugs, and now it's like less shameful, and we see that evolution. Um, I think we need to still come together, because these are all human issues. They're not left or right. They're more about just, the truth is always somewhere in the middle between many of these issues. Ultimately, what's the goal here? The goal is to save lives, and I think that's the common bond. right? That brings everyone together. How can we keep people safe? It doesn't matter. Fentanyl or drug poisonings or overdose deaths, they don't care where you come from or who you are, your background, what community you grew up in, what your religious beliefs are. Like all those things put to the side, this drug is certainly, once people are hooked on it, it's so powerful and it's hard to get off of. I mean, think about it. From heroin, right, to now to synthetic opioids. And now you have synthetic opioids that are even more powerful than acetylfentanyl. You have carfentanyl. You have 3-methyl fentanyl, which is 6,000 times more potent than morphine. So this is scary stuff. I think that we have to get to the point as a nation where we address it. And I do agree with you, Paul. We're behind. We are behind. But we have to rally all these different groups, get them under one umbrella and moving in the same direction so that we can impact this and come about and create change.
Right. And I think I might have misrepresented what I was attempting to say, because many of those that I just listed have become partisan issues. In the case of guns, it's really complicated because you have a Second Amendment that really makes it tricky, right? In the case of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you did have a bipartisan buy-in, like who wants their kids to die of drinking and driving. So I so agree with you. And as we spent many, many months trying to, brands matter, messaging matters. We spent, it seemed like too much time trying to come up with a name and even a logo that, as you can see, it's blue and red. Those are the actual colors, the color codes of the U.S. flag, united together to say that partisanship has no place in something so insidious, and it's so new. And that's what really drew me to you, Ray, when I first heard you speak, because you come from this place of such, I don't want to flatter you here, but expertise, but also saying, look, if we're going to do this thing, we have to do it together. It's too big for us to bicker over. And so with that, my last question is, and it's a tough one, but what do you see in the future, not only for fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, but for an area where money laundering is so much at the heart of this? I know you don't have a crystal ball.
I think it's like any other cycle that we've seen. Post-Vietnam, we saw heroin, obviously the crack epidemic. I think that this too will subside, Paul, or at least that's my hope. I think the more people that rally behind it and the more action that we take to create safeguards, and whether it's through legislation or other means, I think you're going to see it eventually slowly dissipate. Awareness, education is going to be part of that. All these different things that we already hit today eventually will have some impact on this opioid crisis.
Well, Ray, I'm an optimist. Sometimes it seems like it's to a fault, but I'm with you, and you know more people than I do in this space. I mean, I've been, maybe as much as anything else, just humbled with the men and women that I've met, whether it be parents who have lost children, whether it be people in law enforcement, there is unity around a righteous frustration around wanting to roll up the sleeves and get the word out around this issue. And that gives me a lot of hope. It gives me hope every single day. And so I really thank you, Ray. You're a mentor. You're such a nice human being. And I really thank you for taking time off. I'll probably see you later today on some network being interviewed, but it's good spending a few minutes with you.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure.